Greetings, this is Logue Elder, and this is an installment of Let's Talk Consciousness. The purpose or context of these videos is to basically start with the assumption that consciousness is a primary source of reality, or that reality is essentially made of consciousness, and that if you are looking at the world through that assumption, what falls out of that assumption? How do you apply that to your day-to-day life? And so I've done a handful of videos just looking at different life questions, mostly centered around improving the quality of your consciousness through forgiveness of yourself and others. And there are so many directions to take that in that it gets to be a little bit daunting as far as like what do I want to do with that. And mostly it's been, like I said, around forgiveness for yourself and others. So it's been life situations that tend to challenge you as far as letting go of grudges, being non-judgmental, those types of things. So there's a very different angle that I wanted to take with it, which is something that's been really a passion of mine for a long time, but it's seemingly unrelated, but not necessarily. And that is looking at making sense of the world through this consciousness model, and then on another hand, looking at what you make of the world when it comes to basically apprehending the world or understanding it or thinking you understand it as it relates to conspiracies. And that's an important topic as of late to some. There are a lot of people who don't necessarily consider that all that big a part of their awareness or their consciousness, and that's okay. I think that's going to change, and that's kind of the reason behind making this video. It is, in a sense, kind of, it feels like coming out of a closet to some extent, particularly because some of these conspiracies that you get into, and of course you have to be careful about vetting them because there's a lot of bullshit, in the arena that you have to kind of suss out, and it's important to be careful about your sources and things like that. But as some conspiracy theories become reality, as they're verified, it invites you to reassess your understanding of the world and to maybe engage with some thoughts about what the world might be like, or what it's all about, or at least in some dark corners. To an extent that you can incorporate that in your model of reality and not be really vexed by it. Because I think when some people hear about these things, they really shut down because it's so, the implications can be so unsettling. So I'll go through a little bit of the background of how I found myself going in these directions, exploring these concepts, and trying to relate it and make it relatable, hopefully, to someone who's maybe not as well versed in it, and who's maybe finding things out that are opening their eyes to certain things. And again, how it all connects back to spirituality. And as is often the case, I'll start by smoking. It always makes things a bit easier. All right, so my own experience with it, really, it's like the prologue to it is the JFK assassination. As I've got my man JFK over here. So that's kind of a thing that, because it happened well before I was born. I was born in '84, and it happened in '63. But I did get a little of it through my mom. I did get to hear her take on it, and a early memory of mine from being like about 10 years old or so was my mom watching these, I believe they were Senate committee hearings about Ruby Ridge, and then later seeing a movie about Ruby Ridge. And if you don't know, it's kind of a long story that I don't want to necessarily unpack the whole thing, but it's basically a story of a guy who may have been an unsavory character in some senses, but who was seemingly courted and potentially entrapped by, I believe it was the FBI or Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, into selling this undercover person a sawed-off shotgun. What followed was then a standoff at his house that led to several of his family members being killed, and it was a real mar on the reputation of federal authorities. It wasn't that long after, or it was, I believe it was after Waco, but in that time, I was a young person, I was like 10 years old when this was going on. But these are things that I was kind of exposed to, that sometimes the government does fucked up things. Sometimes they use force when they don't have to, and sometimes it seems to relate to an almost ideological conflict. Whether it's Waco being a cult supposedly, and having lots of guns, and having this this kind of different way of seeing things. I mean, that's a really broad brush. It would take a long time to go into Waco, but point being that those little things, in my youth, did kind of plant the seed that conspiracies are around if you're looking, um, and it was just in the background. It wasn't really in the forefront. So fast forward to when I'm 16, that's when 9/11 happens. 17 rather, and it was not unusual to me when it happened. I remember my mom actually knocked on the door and told me to turn on TV and check it out, and I remember her saying they bombed the World Trade Center, and I was thinking again, like, because I remembered in '93 that had happened, and I was thinking it was a more conventional bomb like that. I didn't realize what had really gone on, and the reason that I got kind of kicked off in this direction of looking at things through, trying to question what's going on, is that, bear with me a second. The reason that we were told that Muslim terrorists flew planes into the towers is that they hate our freedom. They hate our freedom? I mean, that was such a flat, unconvincing answer to me, because granted, I knew Muslim terrorism existed, and I knew, or fundamentalism and all breeds. I was familiar with Christians bombing abortion clinics and things like that. I mean, I knew extremism existed, but the thing that didn't make sense was, and I think David Cross pointed this out in one of his specials that came out like right after, was that there are places that are freer than us, that are at least more socially liberal, or have less uptightness and fundamentalism in their own cultures, and like I think the Netherlands was an example, but these places that are more socially free, that are not targets for Muslims, and so that really fell apart as far as a reason, and it seems so blind to what was obviously a long, complicated history with that region of the world, and so that's what sent me down a road of looking at what politically was the background of 9/11, not to mention any of the conspiracy stuff, just politically, what is the background, and that question led me to learning about Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn, which now I have different opinions of those people, but at the time it was at least in a way of opening the door to seeing what American military activity does that can be very underhanded as far as their motives. And we see that obviously with the Iraq War and Afghanistan that followed. We see that there are ulterior motives, that getting into Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. It had everything to do with war profiteering. I mean, that's a long conversation to itself, but this keeps going out. So my point is, that opened a door of just at least questioning, when you're given an official explanation of something happening, do you believe it? And so my general impression throughout my youth, in the 90s and 2000s, was just that politicians are full of shit. And that's a mundane explanation, because they're full of shit, but like, what are they really up to is kind of what unfolds as you get deeper into it. But it wasn't until about 2007, I think, when Loose Change came out, and then a few years later, Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth and things like that, were basically the arguments about the evidence itself start to become pretty compelling about the official story not making sense. So there's, like, for me, the beginning is just the political nonsense of the motive, and then later the physical evidence not really making sense, as far as buildings falling at free fall speed because of fires that don't burn hot enough to melt steel. All the arguments that are out there that I'm not gonna go through, because this isn't the point. The point of this is just a brief background of me getting into conspiracy theories, and then why I'm connecting that to spirituality and consciousness. But anyway, so breaking through the door of considering 9/11 as a planned false flag attack to initiate a war with Middle Eastern countries, that makes sense the further you get. You get distance from the event, and you start to understand what's happened since, and you understand that that's now a pretty plausible explanation of that whole episode. Um, and it's interesting that that almost seems like the tip of the iceberg. I mean, as crazy as that sounds, because there's some people who would look at 9/11 and wouldn't even dream of that being anything other than the official story, which I understand. I mean, you know, there's a very convincing, comforting, believable image that is put out there, as far as like how the world really works, and how these events came to be, and what are the motivations and the stories behind them. I mean, in some regards, not convincing at all if you're a skeptical minded person who has background, context, and information, but to a person who's not looking into those things and has not really been acclimated to that world, being told, something like that 9/11 was in some part involved our government. And if you want the short answer as to why I think that basically you could look at the exercises that were going on at that time that were drills of the exact thing that ended up happening, and then you see that happens in so many other cases where the drills that coincidentally are going on that day are of the event that happens. That's more than coincidence. It would be silly to brush that off as coincidence, especially in more than one case, which is, again, you can do your own research, but that's basically what you'll find if you look. So some involvement, some necessity to move planes away from that area as far as scrambling fighter jets. I mean, these are all really straightforward things that, when you first are exposed to them, are unbelievable. If you think of your government as being, maybe a kind of boring malevolence, like they're just inept and they want your taxes and they're not really providing much in the way of services and they're making a little money for themselves on the side, like that seems like a certain kind of cynicism about the situation, but it almost seems to kick it up to a whole new level when you think that those people would be willing to kill Americans to forward their plans. But if you look at things that have come out in terms of releases, and I'm really just going through the stuff that most people already know when they're exposed to this. I'm hoping that somehow this reaches people who are somehow on the fence. But as far back as the Kennedy administration, there were people who wanted to plan false flag attacks. Operation Northwoods is the key phrase if you're looking it up. But that was a plan to try to initiate a false flag that would trigger us into a war with Cuba. Thankfully, that plan didn't come to fruition at that time. And in some ways, it did come to fruition at 9/11 if you connect those dots. But point being, these are things that are inconceivable until you really find that there is evidence, and it's evidence that most people are not willing to open their eyes to, or to look up for themselves, and that's what keeps these things going. And I think this is a significant time because it seems like more and more and more and more information is getting out in a higher profile way. I mean, just within the last 10 years, it's like we could barely creep the door open, some of us, just to look into the 9/11 thing. But, now you have people who are reporting on stuff that just sounds psychotic if you don't have any sort of familiarity with it. But, secret space program, um, you know, uh, ancient civilizations that we know all sorts of things about, we being government in a sense, that is kept a secret, all these things that are just crazy. Alien presence on Earth, participation with government deals going back to the 1940s, or whatever. Those are all things that are talked about in this community of conspiracy theorists, or truth movement. By the way, I don't think conspiracy theory or theorists should be a pejorative. I think time will tell that a lot of those people who were seen as crazy were right, and that will not be a pejorative, or at least hopefully not. Tinfoil hat, obviously, that's the that's the thing you don't want to be. You don't want to be the person who just seems outwardly insane. But if you are delving into these theories and you're able to discuss them openly and then find the research that supports them, I don't think it's so crazy, and I think time will tell on that one. But anyway, average people not initiated to this kind of thing will not have an easy time taking in those ideas. I experience it all the time because I talk to people about these things at various levels of interest and try to come to people at their level, but sometimes I blow it. I go a little too far too fast. Quick example, telling somebody about Lady Di, and that's not even like really my 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 favorite. This sounds weird to say it that way, but it's not one that I've looked into that deeply. But I do know the peripheral details, and I can see that it's suspicious. And I'm assuming that the motive for her death will probably come out at some point far later, but who knows. Anyway, um, I told that to somebody whose experience with that sort of things was just what television told them. Like, they had no acclimation to that idea at all, and I could see the kind of disbelief and discomfort that it caused. And I know that there are going to be a lot of people that are going to have that similar kind of panic and discomfort. So the point of this first video is just to, I don't know, I don't think I did it in 15 minutes, but I'm going to do this in parts. But is to run through my own brief experience getting up to speed on some strange conspiracy theories, but why I think them, and why I think they do make a connection to spiritual ideas, which I'm going to get to in the next video.